Can anybody think of any specific video game that's currently going that has millions of subscribers that was based on a video game? I mean, a video game that's based on a tabletop role-playing game. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, well, I was going to say World of Warcraft, but it doesn't have a tabletop version of it.
Yes, it does.
It does.
And did you know that World of Warcraft was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons?
I did not.
Yes, literally, the whole time they were writing vanilla Warcraft, they had the 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons rule set on their desk that they were reviewing constantly, and that's why you've got a paladin, you've got a druid, you've got a rogue. It was based on 3.5 rules, and later in the cycle, they did get a World of Warcraft role-playing game that was put out by the Swords and Sorcery imprint of White Wolf, which is defunct at this point, and they only came out with one half of the rules. Because the same company didn't just do the World of Warcraft RPG, and it was nothing like the World of Warcraft Druid. It was just a straight up cut and paste of the D&D Druid. So didn't do the same type of shape shifting. And then the same design company did the other big MMO at the time that I can't even remember anymore. But they only put out the rules for the classes for that one, and all of the magic stuff. There was supposed to be a completely separate book of magic. Never came out in physical version, it only came out in PDF.
You could also say the same for Baldur's Gate. You could say the same for Mass Effect and its RNG,
Yes.
its attack capabilities.
Because the company that made that is also the one that did Coach War, which was based off of the previous version of the Star Wars rules.
Yeah, that Fantasy Flight one. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're basically all video games are math, and all board games are math. And you have to have the fun creative side, and you have to have your math guy.
Yeah. So the big thing that a video game can get away with that you can't really do so much in a tabletop game is it can be more math intensive. It can have a lot more mathematical elements because the computer is being the GM there. You don't have a guy with a stack of 14 books who's sitting there looking up rules and doing math calculations in between everything that's going on. If your system's done right, that smooth stuff is going on in the background, and you only notice that you've pointed the sniper rifle at the guy and pulled the trigger. Would you say that's fair?
Oh yeah.
All right. So, what kinds of things do you guys think you could learn for tabletop or RPGs that you could backward, say, from video games? I already know of two very specific things that are going on in some stuff, but I'm looking if you've got any ideas. Or vice versa, conversely, let's carry out that particular conversation of, are there any other video games out there that you can tell were inspired in some way by a tabletop game?
I would say definitely the Diablo series.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Same basic concept, except it was a different way that they applied it. Again, Diablo, you've got your rogue, you've got your warrior, and you've got your mage. So it was kind of a same iteration, except that it's more based on second edition Dungeons and Dragons. And Diablo came before World of Warcraft, but even the more recent Diablo 4, is a little bit more of an MMO, but it's taken a lot of those ideas from some of the original Diablo and refined them. But it actually looks even more like a tabletop RPG than the original Diablo. Anybody else got any other, maybe not necessarily a role-playing game, but there are some other video games that do things that are kind of board game-esque. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Civ? Civ.
Civilization.
Yeah, Civilization. Okay. Yeah. 4x4. Yeah. There are board games with that stuff out there now, and there were board games with that kind of stuff out there before. I mean, if you look at games like Twilight Imperium, and then take a look at Stellaris, there are a lot of that kind of game design that's moved forward to video games. I would say Donkey Kong is another one that kind of has those board game elements. In fact, there was, when I was a child, and I'm showing my age, there was a Donkey Kong board game at one point in time. And it was it was directly related to that. If you look at games like, say, Hungry Hippos, you see a lot more video gaming of board games these days. You know, you'll see something like Elder Sign. A lot of Fantasy Flight games got turned into a video game version. And you see a lot of stuff now where you've got an app, like My Father's Work. Anybody here familiar with that? You need to play My Father's Work. You're dressed perfectly to play the part. My Father's Work is kind of a, Victor Frankenstein, Dracula. You're in the Carpathian Hills. You get to name your village, and you, over the course of 3 generations, are trying to complete your father's work. And it might be a golem, or it might be a love serum, or it might be a time machine, and you're generationally trying to complete that. But one of the things that runs that game is there's a desktop app that reads you the interludes and inserts things based on the characters that you have and the town you've made up. And there's a really hilarious story that I have sometime you should ask me about, where we invented Spanx and destroyed a town with them. Exploding Spanx, that's all I'm gonna say.
I assume everyone here has games on their phone.
Oh yeah.
Right? No, not really.
Kind of.
Yeah, I do this weird thing. I use my phone to make phone calls and texts.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah.
It freaks people out.
Also for notes, amazing for notes.
Oh yeah, amazing for notes. For stuff like today, I've got a ton of notes on my phone.
Yeah.
But there are people, believe it or not, I'm gonna blow your mind a little bit, who play video games on their phone. And that's exclusively what their phone seems to be for, because every time you're trying to talk to them, it's like, hold on, I'm Candy Crushing.
Yeah. But all of those apps are basically, well, I mean, not like the Call of Duty shooter ones, but like basically all of those apps are animated board games.
Pretty much.
If you have a Clash of Clans type game, that's just an area control, it's just a base builder, engine builder
Any
type
of those
thing.
runner games.
Yeah, the runner games are just path games, they're puzzle games, basically. What I love about the board game industry now is that we're seeing a lot of being able to play a board game on your phone or on your computer with other people virtually. But, is everyone here for just the video game aspect, or are they here for the board game aspect? What are some of the things that you guys were hoping to get out of?
Yeah, what part of game design interests you when it comes to the intersection between game design and video games?
Can we just go around?
Yeah.
So that way we're making sure that we hit everybody.
I like that. Make sure we're hitting everybody's likes.
Yeah. So you're a cartoon artist, illustrator.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing any design? Are you looking to do like a Paper Mario type game?
Yeah, I noticed your Mario racing shirt.
Yeah, is it 3-dimension, or are you just?
Like character design, concept art, kind of that kind of stuff. Coming up with ideas in general, I guess you could say.
Okay.
I tend to like a lot of that kind of stuff.
Understood. What about you guys back there? Yeah.
I just like the intricacies of how video games and board games themselves have to be balanced to make a fun gameplay experience that feels fair but also challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I was hoping to hear more about that.
Okay.
My interest kind of focuses in on the idea of how do you take a fantasy that you're trying to evoke and then make the math work in a way that makes that fantasy feel good without becoming burdensome and having too much crunch to make that fantasy happen.
Got it.
Okay.
Story versus mechanics. How do you make that fit?
Yeah.
Got it. Or theme versus mechanics. How do you make that fit?
What about you at the back?
This isn't really my industry.
Okay.
I'm a souvenir manufacturer and stuff like that, and
Hey, you still gotta pay
I'm
attention
a
to your
wireless
audience.
entanglement puzzle maker,
Okay.
and I just accidentally kind of stumbled into this.
Nothing wrong
And so
with that.
I'm just sitting in it and taking it all in.
So are your puzzles unique? Like in terms of I assume they're like logic puzzles or path puzzles?
They're wire disentanglement.
Okay.
And,
Oh, yeah.
And we manufacture and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
We are on the low end of the souvenir spectrum. and we sell to just novelty shops all throughout North America.
Uh-huh.
Well, with your puzzles, it still has to be challenging enough to be interesting, but not so difficult that they can't solve it and be like, I win!
Right, and then,
They need that dopamine
the
rush.
repeatability is, okay, so, and we market them as old-time puzzles, whereas, you know, traditional farmers used to make these puzzles for their kids and stuff,
Mhm.
where you could go to Walmart and buy something. But what we are finding is that our consumer is, with the way that, the rise of the phones and the video games and stuff like that, that handheld manipulation, it doesn't seem to be as attractive.
Gotcha.
You can't get the dopamine rush from our stuff anymore.
Well, they can
They're
if you can get
desensitized.
it in their hands.
Yeah.
If they're too interested in what is already in their hands.
Right.
But the thing is that they get bored with that a lot
Right.
faster. A lot of your kinetic things, though, are gonna last a lifetime. It's, for you, the challenge is gonna be getting it into their hands, because if they touch it and have that kinetic connection, it's gonna last a lot longer than the video game.
Right, and then, and we have other lines of
Yeah.
different things,
Yeah.
but that, and so, I'm here,
Okay.
I'm just curious.
Sure.
Hey, thank you for coming. What about you, young man?
I'm also just curious.
Okay.
I'm here with him, and I've been playing games in general for most of my life, and
Nothing wrong with that.
I'm just-
I'm still playing games. I'm almost in my 50s. Don't stop.
Yeah,
Okay, that's-
I like playing games, man. Prefer it.
I know the two of you were talking about role-playing games earlier, so what about the video game thing kind of intrigued you?
I'm intrigued by the conversation threads and loops in a video game that you can have.
Yes.
I don't know how to.
Like a choose your own adventure path.
Exactly. Now, how in the heck am I going to put that in a board game? That's
You just make adventure paths. I mean, you decide what forks would be interesting. And that's what's easy to code is you know, you'll see the drop down list, like say Mass Effect. You'll see that you'll have a branch, but if you do it right, they'll never see the other branches unless they replay the game. So for you, you just gotta make those branches. What about you, sir?
Hi, my name's Sean, first off. Second off, I'm a Dungeon Master in 5th edition. I have an interest in video games as a general, and what I'm hoping to get out of this lecture is to figure out the right balance between randomness and not screwing people over. Because yeah, 50 dragons spawn on you. That's interesting. It's not fun.
Right.
It can be if you've got a catch-up mechanic. We've talked about a lot of that over the weekend already. So a lot of times when you have something that feels unfair, you can get something that can give you a leg up and let you come back from behind. We refer to those as a catch-up mechanic. You see that in anybody here familiar with a game called Quacks of Quedlinburg? See at least a couple of nods. So that is a really neat game where you make draws, blind draws, to try and get stuff to pull out of your bag. But if you draw too much, it's a kind of a push your luck mechanic where you can end up causing your potion to literally blow up in your face. But you end up building this spiral, and you get a tail mechanic that allows you to get extra draws if you're in behind. And the guy in the head, though, they still get their same amount of draws, but the number of extra draws you get is based on whoever's in the lead. So that's what we refer to as a catch-up mechanic, because in theory it allows you to catch up with the person in the lead. So you might be dead last, but there's a possibility for you to be able to, you know, do a better amount of draws without having your thing explode in your face. So that's what you do. But for tabletop design, a lot of your stuff is going to be making up the difference. You're also going to see, like I mentioned earlier, you're generally going to want less math. So you're going to want simpler rules that are more easy to hold in your head or have on a cheat sheet, as opposed to stuff you've got to look up some of those, a lot of people, there are people who like really crunchy rules, but there are also people who can hold those rules in their head. I was watching Battletech the other night, and the guy who was running the Battletech, he knew everything. He didn't have to reference the rules once. If that was me, we would have been there for the entire 2-hour period, just me looking up the rules every couple of minutes. I'm gonna go grab some water real
Yeah.
quick.
Sorry, I was looking for a specific game for your topic and I couldn't find it. Right?
I recommend Mansions of Madness.
So-
Yes, Mansions of Madness is great.
Since we all talk this way, why don't we talk? Will we give you the chance yet?
That's fine.
Yeah.
I make all kinds of games. I make board games, tabletops, digital games.
Mhm.
First couple of games I made were computer games.
Yeah.
One was a platformer, the other was a visual novel.
Okay.
I'm pretty much just here to absorb every bit of knowledge I can.
Gotcha. And then I got a chance to read over your RPG yesterday, so
Yeah.
we're both making RPGs right now. Different settings, different functions, all that fun stuff. But so I think it's interesting on the RPGs because we have RPG people over here.
Yeah.
It's just interesting how things are set. So
We're sitting on the wrong side.
yeah. So on the RPG side stuff and trying to convert those talk trees or those character trees into a more board game type function, there's actually a lot of these that are out now where it's like, you know, how do I put it? There's storytelling in a box where you're murder mystery in a box type games or solving, you know, group solves with someone running those types of games.
Mouse guard.
Mouse guard, yeah, exactly. So, my encouragement would be write everything out. You have to write your entire story first, and then you can figure out where you can pull those conversation points or action points. So maybe it's you move along the story along the board, or maybe it's, you know, all card driven. So if you say, okay, I want to ask this question, when that question comes up, your GM or whoever's running the game can go to that. Or it's just in a book. I mean, there are plenty of tabletop games where the game is run from each individual book.
Yeah, my father's work, the story changes and you move to a different page and all of a sudden the village has changed based on what happened last generation.
Exactly.
So you could have something similar for, say, a conversation, or you could have conversation cards. You could use Rory's story cubes. Those are great randomizers for things because they are literally pictures on a dice, a 6-sided die, and they're interpreted like tarot cards. So you get to decide what that B means. And I do mean like a little bzzz, it's gonna sting you kind of B, not, you know, just the letter B. Today's presentation is brought to you by the letter B and the number 17.
In terms of like the feeling that you're getting when people are trying to play the game,
Yeah.
what you're trying to do is balance really three things. You're trying to balance the story theme, you're trying to balance the math, which is the RNG to make it feel balanced, and then you're also trying to manage or add in chaos.
Yeah.
And chaos is the hard thing to get into tabletop games, but it's a lot easier to get into video games. Because, yes, there's a logic to it, but the chaos can like have a weird effect on the logic in a video game, which is where you see sometimes bugs because it's not working the right way, or things are spawning in at the wrong time, or you're not able to make a specific jump because the logic just cut it off at a certain point, whereas everywhere else on the map it doesn't have that logic base. So the chaos is going to come from your programming and capability, or whoever's doing the design, but it's also going to come in from, you know, you don't want this to just be Rails, because if it's all math and logic, it's just going to feel like you're going down one path every time. Even if you give them choices, when they split, it's still, you're on a rail. But if there's chaos involved where you add these multiple trees, but it still circles back into the rail, it seems like you're having more fun. Even though you don't know what happens from, you know, for talking a strict branch, you don't know what happens when this one branches, but it all ends up coming back to this end logic. So it's a difficult balance in a tabletop game because you're dealing with dice most of the time.
Most of your chaos
That's where your chaos or your RNG comes from. you're replacing a dice roll, which is typically 1 through 6, sometimes 1 through 20, with modifiers on it. But in the RNG in a video game, that number can be 100, that number can be 1,000, that number can be 100,000. You can really adjust the percentages.
Or it could just be binary, 0 and 1,
Yes.
either on or off.
On or off. So you get a little bit more flexibility in a video game than you get in a tabletop game. However, when you're coming back to it, it makes it a lot easier to determine what you want your end game to be on a tabletop.
So I know that you guys are interested in stuff that you could port back, say, to your tabletop game. What are you guys looking for with your game design? Are you looking to design a video game? Or are you looking to design a tabletop game? Or what is it you're interested in when it comes to those game design thoughts that you're talking to us about?
Well, I just love
Implementation, I guess, is
Yeah.
the better correct.
So for my implementation, I just love systems and understanding how they function. And in spare time, I will randomly try to port like a video game I enjoy to a tabletop game, and it's always bogged down with so much extra math that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Because that's how the video game is set up with like so much math. And so in terms of balancing, it's like trying to figure out how to crunch that down to make it easier for the in-game experience.
Oh, I can tell you how to do that pretty easy. That's one of the things that gets discussed a lot in a lot of tabletop forums or board game forums. At that point, you aren't trying to emulate the math. You're trying to emulate the feel, how it feels in play. So, like, say, what's your favorite video game?
The one that I was attempting to port over into a video game was actually just Final Fantasy X. I did that a couple of years
Oh,
back.
that's simple.
Yeah.
You know what Final Fantasy was predicated on?
No.
Okay, so literally, Japan is roughly 20 years behind the United States when it comes to their tabletop game market. Yeah. Final Fantasy was a bunch of Japanese game designers sitting around playing 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. So even with their airships and all of that, that was how the Japanese interpreted the Western RPG of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So
The big thing for like Final Fantasy X and a lot of the more recent ones is be things like game spheres and stuff of that nature. Video game that I got mentioned in my last panel, I'm going to recommend, I should say tabletop RPG that you should look at. Go look up Fabula Ultima on Drive-Thru RPG. It's fantastic. It does exactly what you want. And it's by Need Games. It is fantastic.
To try and help you, I also recommend you look at the tabletop Pokemon game that came out a few years ago. It simplifies a lot of the math of Pokemon
Yes.
down to trying to feel like a Pokemon game instead.
Yeah, that's again the thing that you want to look at when you're trying to emulate, say, something like Mass Effect or like you said, the Final Fantasy. You want to emulate how the game feels to you when the mechanics make it feel like you're playing that game you've hit.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do in our game design, not so much our card games, but some of our more, bigger games that we're working on, is we justify having, so like as you're going backwards from video game to board game, like justify this in the field and then justify this in the gameplay. So in the field, it doesn't, like, let's say for example you have earth, wind, fire, and water as your magic components. We'll just go Avatar off of that, right? So you have those 4 things. When your character has their branch tree, right, or their character tree or their skill tree or whatever you're doing, in an RPG, you choose one of these 4 and you kind of go down. But what if you just want magic to be, those are the 4 elements of the type of magic that you don't want. You want all of your characters to be able to use all 4. Well, do you have them build out in all 4? Or does it all become one? Occam's razor says it all becomes one. It simplifies the process for the user. They have to do less calculations. They have to do less point buys. They have to do less planning for their character because they can just say, I wanna be good at Magic, I'm putting my points into Magic. RPGs do this great, right? I put my points into willpower, I put my points into, where's charisma, you know what I mean? I put my points into, intelligence. And that is the more you can simplify it going from video to tabletop, the more Occam's razor, the simplest answer, and the smallest description is the best description, especially when it comes to tabletop, unless you're building a 4-hour, 5-hour game, in which case, okay, maybe you have to add in some additional things for these character development.
But then you're probably gonna have something that's gonna help you remember it, like a card or a cheat sheet or something that's on your character sheet if it's a role-playing game. You're gonna have something there that's there to trigger the memory. There's actually in a book of essays called The White Box Game Design, in a box. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, if you're interested in that kind of stuff for game design, we have our White Box Game Design contest on Sunday. Go up to registration, pay the $30 for the box of stuff, and then come design games and we'll critique you. But they've got that box, that essay that's in there. One of the things they talk about that is that there's actually a formula for fun mathematically. And that is that the less mental load that your players are gonna have to do, the less effort they have to put into getting at the fun of your game, the more fun they're gonna have. The more mental effort that they have to put into it, the more that they have to invest, the more difficult and steps between them and the fun, the less engaging your game is going to be. It looks like you've got a question.
So you said from video game to board game, less math, simplified makes it better.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean the opposite is true? So if you're going from board game to video game, the more complicated it is would be better?
Not necessarily.
It means that you have more potential to add that and for it to still be fun.
Yeah. You can basically, video games give you all of the cool ideas that you had for your tabletop that you had to cut out, the ability to put them in. That's basically what it is. Because as a game designer in the tabletop space, we're constantly coming up with, oh, what if you could do this, or what if you could do this? That would be so much cooler. But mechanically, it just doesn't work within the rails that you set up within your game. And mathematically, it makes it, you can't roll D1000s. You can roll, 2 D100s, but even then, it just becomes like, okay, but now, all right, so that's 963 against 1,000. All right, now what does that mean in the scaling and things like that? That's just automatically done within the UI of a video game. It just takes whatever that cool thing that you can't fit into your tabletop and makes it animated, pretty, and makes the math work. Whereas, taking that down, like how do you turn a sniper shot in a video game? You just, push in, zoom in your scope, and pull the trigger, right? In an RPG, you have to roll for that. Do you roll for each step in that process? Because that's what you're doing 3 things when you're taking a sniper shot in a shooter game, right? You're tracking the target, you're zooming in on the target, you might even be holding your breath on the target to give yourself a little bit better stability and aim, and then you're pulling the trigger on the target. Doing all 4 of those steps in a tabletop, you're just gonna be, I missed my breath hold.
Yeah. If it was a game about, we talked a little bit about this in the last panel. If it was a game about being a sniper and having those 4 steps, that would be important. But if your game was we had somebody talk about this in the last game, that my game's about exploration, but I want really good rules for combat. If you have a lot of rules for combat and only some rules for exploration, your game's not about exploration anymore, it's about combat. Where you put your pillars of support, that's what your game's gonna be about.
Yeah.
I did have a couple of examples I wanted to show about things being easily backported. How many people here have heard of or played Red Dead Redemption 2? You're just about everybody. Great, this is a great example. So there was a person for a game jam 2 years ago, took the mechanic, all of those different little mechanics of the dials at the bottom of the screen for your focus and your stamina and your health, and build those into a game mechanic that you can use for a board game or role-playing game called Cores. You can find it on itch. It's by by a group called Mindstorm, and he took those dials and he built them as game tech for people who are trying to build, you know, a role-playing game or a board game that has those same expendable bits. And it works, but it works by being simple. It takes the same concept, but executes it very simply. And for those of you who were interested, I mentioned talking about the game that I'm running later this evening. My game used those cards. So he made it as freely available, and I grabbed it. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna work that into my Star Wars-esque game, like my space opera game. So there are things that could be learned. There are lessons for that can be backported. For instance, in a lot of games, like say Mass Effect, or any game that's got a really interesting, very thematic user interface, especially for my role-playing people, what would you say is the user interface of an RPG?
Character sheet.
Absolutely. So you can learn lessons from video games that you can backport to your role-playing games or your board game design, because your user interface for a board game, you know, you're seeing more and more board games that have a player board as well as a little cheat sheet that's usually just a single card that has the rules for the game on both sides of the card, trying to simplify some of that mental load we were talking about. So the less mental load somebody's got to carry, the more fun they're going to have. I can't remember how that works. Well, look at your cheat sheet. Oh yeah, okay, I'm doing this. So that's a way to try and simplify and streamline, because the video game takes that mental load off by just running everything in the back, and you don't ever see how the sausage is being made. Whereas in a role-playing game, that stuff's kind of right there in front of you. The random number generator is your dice, and who doesn't enjoy rolling dice? You know, that's one of the places where your video game doesn't have the tactile thing that we were talking about earlier. You don't have that tactical ability to grab your dice and roll it, or grab some cards and shuffle it, and move that around and manipulate it. But you've got that with the role-playing game and your board game, and you need to capitalize on those elements. Yeah, you may not have a lot of really cool, really complicated math running in the background, but you've got other things you can capitalize on. You want to focus on and capitalize on what you can in your medium. Mm-hmm. You've got what we refer to in the board game industry as table presence. This is something I know you're going to know really well. Could you mind explaining table presence to the group?
Do you mean in the RPG function, or
specifically just general tabletop game?
Okay. So how do I put this? So there's a number of things I think that come into the table presence. Obviously, like if someone looks at your board while you have it set up, like they're immediately going to have a reaction to it, right?
Your user interface.
Yeah, that's your user interface. That's your home screen. That's your, you know, everybody has the same thing, whether, you know, you're looking at the actual video game itself, but once you load in and it starts taking you through your tutorial, that's basically you setting up your board, giving everybody the pieces that they're going to have.
And people starting to walk over and go, what's this?
Exactly. The next piece of table presence that I like to think about is everybody engaged? Are they on their phones? You know, in between their rounds, in between their playing, in between their things. If you create a game where this automatically goes over here because people are doing this, you've already done a good job.
That's that advantage of the kinetics that we were talking about.
Yeah.
You just need to get your product in their hands. Once they do, they're gonna forget their phone for a while.
Right. Exactly. And then it's also simplicity. Like if you come over to something and they have, you know, 30 different tabs and 30 different little tiny, you know, cardboard cutouts, and you have 7 different minis.
Unless you know how to organize it, like terraforming Mars.
Yeah, that kind of thing is also going to affect whether or not you're going to get engagement. Now, I'm not going to sit down and play a 3-hour game unless it's like the new Cyberpunk game,
Yeah.
right? Or Return to the Dark Tower kind of.
Yes, that thing's so good.
Yeah, so I'm not going to sit down and play a 3-hour game because I don't have the time to do that. If I'm coming to interact with friends, I want to know what that number is on the side of the box, on how long it's going to take me to complete this game, and always add 15 to 30 minutes. Because no matter what,
Especially if it's the first time you're playing
Yeah.
it, it's gonna take at least an extra half hour.
yeah. So, you know, your first couple rounds are teaching. So the easier that you can get them to the immediate gameplay, the simpler it is for them to understand your game, the more clear your rules are, the more, again, Occam's razor, the more toned down it is so you can get to the fun faster. That's gonna be immediately apparent from just looking at your board, right? You know how quickly you can learn Boop because it is anybody here familiar with Boop? Okay, Boop is an asymmetric board game where you're just trying to boop kittens off of a bed so you can move your cats home. It's every time that you put a kitten down, it boops whatever kittens are adjacent to it, and it moves them off. So it's like, you put something down, it spreads the board, you put something down, it pulls it back in, depending on where you put it. If you went into the game room today, Boop is set up over there, Boo, the Halloween version. You can immediately see that game and you can be like, I can learn this game in less than 15 minutes and I can play rounds after round after round every 20 minutes. If I'm playing someone competitively that knows what they're doing, if I'm playing somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, the game could last a little bit longer. So when it comes to your table presence, it's not just about the design of the box, it's not just about the design of the pieces and stuff, it's about the whole piece and what kind of emotion. I know we talked about emotion a little bit. We're trying to elicit just by seeing that.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant by table presence?
Very much
Okay.
so. And
You're
again,
in it.
it ties it.
Sorry, I.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. We're at the point where we're gonna be taking lots of questions,
Yeah.
so go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about the mental load factor, because I'm assuming you're meaning the mental load of understanding like the rules of the game, not necessarily the mental load of playing the game.
A little bit of both, actually, because your mental load of if you're trying to retain the rules
Yeah.
in your head, the more stuff that's crammed into your head, and you're not just. A lot of people, when they sit down to play a game, they just kind of want to sit down and have fun, but your game usually is going to have steps and rules and things, and the less of those rules, those mechanics that they've got to continue to remember round after round, that kind of gets in the way, that extra effort they've got to expend, that kind of gets in the way of them just getting to the fun.
Yeah.
So it's both complexity and how many steps they've got to go through to get to that dopamine rush.
Building on that, and all of like the tabletop RPGs you've played, about how much time would you say is spent by both by players and GMs looking up the rules and doing the things in between taking actions in game?
That definitely would fall into it. If you've got to look up every rule for every action, what's really frustrating as a game master is having some really simple rules, and this is both for tabletop gaming as well as trying to do role-playing game. If the rules are really simple and you can't get the players to learn it, that is going to get in the way of the game master or whoever owns the board game and is trying to teach it. If you have to re-explain the rules every round, that's going to get old for everybody. Go ahead, sir.
I will say on that point, one rule my group has never learned is fall damage. It very rarely comes up. It's something we apply, but there's practically there's 2 sentences worth of fall damage in 5th edition.
Yeah.
And and anytime it does come up, because one of us falls off a cliff, we do have to look it up real fast.
Yeah. So I think a good learning process is, how many people here have played an 18-card game? Anybody? Is anybody familiar with 18 cards? 18 card pickup? Okay. They've been around for a long time. It's the simplest way you can play a card game. It's usually 2 to 4 players, and usually you get a card and you can only do one action with that card, or you get a group of cards and you can only do certain things with
Love
those
letters.
cards. Yeah, love letters are
Yes,
great example of
yes.
that. Love Letter 2 is another game that's similar to
Yep,
that.
has that.
If you're familiar with 2, Shiner, our 18-card game. There's tons of them out there. 18-card games are great at taking the fun and getting it to you immediately. And it's fun because the meta is immediately available to you because the rules basically tell you what the meta is.
Yeah, because they're usually right there on the card. You don't need to know anything else than what it is telling you.
Yeah. So think about each step in your tabletop game or your RPG game or your video game being to, you know, making sure that each one of those capabilities or functions could be its own maybe 18 card game or something similar to that. So that you're not convoluting how those interact with each other will obviously convolute it, but you're not convoluting that step. You're making that step options razor. You know what the fun is. You know what the fun is of the fireball. You know what you have to do to get to the fireball, right?
I'm having fun just when you mentioned fireball, because all of the times that they've been used in games I've been involved with. It's
Exactly.
always fun.
Yeah.
It's always chaotic and it's always fun.
Exactly.
Sometimes for different reasons.
So if you're not familiar with 18 card games like Love Letter, I don't know if everybody is, plays Love Letter or Coup or anything like that. Just go on to Board Game Geek or some other board game site, search your 18 card games, and just start looking through their rule sets. How, you know, it'll be immediately understood not only how you win, but how other players are going to try to counter your win, or how you counter other players' win, because it's only 18 cards. You're very limited in the rules. You're very limited in. So the more you can limit yourself in those mechanics, the better it's going to be.
Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I did have a question for board games. So like Warhammer, Battle.net, stuff like that. These are very complicated board games.
Mm-hmm.
Are these just outliers, or is it like a niche market? Because I would argue Warhammer 40K and little figurines is one of the most popular tabletop games.
It is.
Is
It is.
so, but you keep
And the
saying that.
newest edition of the game is the least popular they've ever made.
So there is a niche for very, very complicated games, right?
Yes.
There's a clear market for it, right? It's
Yes.
more Euro and more actually Asian markets that are more interested in those types of games than people in the United States. But you know, there are plenty of Terraforming Mars is a great example,
Yes.
right? That game might be, or Wingspan even, if you played Wingspan.
Oh yeah.
These are long games with very complicated rule sets, with very complicated metas that take you multiple playthroughs to kind of understand how each one comes through.
Yes.
There's 100% a market for that.
Yeah.
And if you want to make that kind of game and play that kind of game, then do it. Like, I don't want to discourage you from making any kind of game that you want to make. Just be mindful that even the rule sets within those massive games all try to cut down a little bit in each section.
Yeah.
Right? In 40K, it's, you know, data, attack, movement, speed, and all kinds of different rule sets for one attacking certain type of units or versus others. That's just them doing the math out so that it can remain complicated.
That's why you generally see there are things that you've got all of the special rulers, they've got the special dice. Each unit has a unit card, so if you're fielding those units, either you've memorized those cards or you've got those unit cards on the table. Instead of a cheat card, they have a cheat sheet, double-sided with rules for that on both sides. The less you have to look at the rules, the better. So with a more complicated game, they've got more complicated mnemonic devices.
That being said, like, if you're talking wargaming, right? You have things on the 40K end, and then you have stuff all the way down at the, the Warlord gaming end. I don't know if you guys are familiar with any of the Warlord games.
One page wargaming rules.
Yeah, it all fits on a simple rule. You're just pulling dice, rolling, and if you're in range, you hit. If you're not in range, you don't. If you hit, you just eliminate it, you get off of it. Incredibly simple rules. And the Warlord gaming, they have like 7 different periods throughout history that they have all of their games through. So it goes like from Roman times all the way up to World War II type stuff, or Vietnam.
Whereas Ross Babcock, the guy who wrote Battletech, is here this weekend. He's going to be talking tomorrow night. We had a charity game Thursday night, and the guy who was running that, he had double-sided laminated cheat sheets for each player, a tape measure for each player, a set of dice for each player. They were color-coded so that they could do the different actions, and each of them had their mech sheet on front of them, laminated with a dry erase marker so that they could track damage. So again, they've got that stuff, but again, it's how much you want to really put in their hands. So with them, they've offloaded a bunch of that mental load by having more complicated tools, but you definitely can do it.
Yeah. And it falls into that feel category, right?
Yes.
So 40K feels completely different than Bolt Action, which is a Warlord game, which
Yeah.
feels completely different than Dungeons and Dragons when you're going through. They're all miniature games, right? Or any mini game that you go to play, right? Each one, mini games are typically more complicated, not necessarily, but typically more complicated than Sorry, right? You're still moving little pieces, but it just becomes that more complicated process. And Sorry is a family game with introduced chaos, where the chaos levels are high. And none of this factors into something that we haven't even talked about yet, which is very prevalent in video games and less of a market in the tabletop function, which are dexterity games, right? That's a market that really hasn't developed in the United States very much.
But it's much bigger in other markets.
Yeah, like Class, Crokinole, those are like 500-year-old. Well, Class is a-
Burrito.
Yeah, Burger Burrito. The
Egyptian rat slap.
huh?
Egyptian rat slap.
Yeah. Those, whatever you want to call it. So, dexterity games can be, you can have a shooting game that is dexterity based. You can have, you can, especially with 3D printing and STL formats and things like that, it's becoming much easier to create dexterity based stuff that will function fairly regularly. It's not going to work perfectly, like the catapult game. Eventually, you're going to have to switch out rubber bands or that kind of thing. But there is the opportunity for you to take some of the dexterity-based stuff that is in your favorite video game and put it into your tabletop. As long as it's not like you have to use the dexterity. The dexterity can't be the winning scenario. It's just it's an RNG actually, because you don't know how well the shooter or putt slide or catapult is going to work each time.
It's RNG to a point, but
Yeah.
it's definitely a skill.
Yes.
to it.
Yes.
I mean, you cheat one way or the other.
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Okay,
So,
we've got time for one.
I don't, anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, so a person that participates in a tabletop game or whatever, besides entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
what are the other 2 or 3 things that they're getting out of participation in that game?
So, all tabletop games are math. So you automatically are learning a little bit of math, whether you want to admit it or
But
not.
they're not showing up to that table to do math.
No, they're not. They're going up there to have fun,
Okay.
right?
They're going
up there to pass time. They're going up there to engage with people.
Okay, so,
Hopefully.
Yeah. They're there for that.
so
dopamine hit.
socialize and kill time. Because that's what I do with the game
Yep.
on my phone, I kill time.
Yep.
That's all it does.
Yeah. And then there are you go to Gen Con or some of the bigger cons. There are a number of this is a profession for some people. Some people just go and play these games and they win a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they win a lot of trips and they win a lot of things as well. So there is a competitive aspect, just like there is in Major League Gaming or whatever you want to call it, MLG or all of the different competitive things. The one thing that you don't get from virtual tabletop play or video game play is the personal interaction. So one of the things that I like to talk about is you're across the table from someone, you get that socialization, for kids, you learn how to have conflict resolution without having a
Throwing fists.
yeah, exactly. You're not throwing a controller across the room.
Yeah.
If you flip a table, you're not going to get invited back to play with those folks. So it's kind of a way of
You're also learning patience.
patience. There's a lot of things that you can learn playing tabletop that you don't get from playing video games.
Critical thinking skills.
So as you're developing the fun and you're explaining your tabletop game on the back of your box, you're trying to engage them into that feeling and into that socialization that you're hoping to build off of. That being said, there are a ton of games out there, and there's actually, I can't remember what the group is. There's a teachers group that will endorse games.
Yeah.
And once it's endorsed, it can go up on their website. And so if you're trying to teach something within your tabletop game, there's one that is like the housing market. Like, how do you teach kids how to buy a house? There's an actual board game. It was developed by somebody out of St. Louis that teaches you how to buy houses, how to invest in property, how to do those types of things. So tabletop games and video games can both do that, but if you want the interaction and the actual chaos that occurs in the world and the competition that occurs in the world for those types of things, it's better done in person. Just like Monopoly.
Yeah, and I can tell you there's a reason why you see game theory and game design at the collegiate level, because the military engages and stuff like that. It teaches critical thinking skills. Unfortunately, we got to wrap this up. There's somebody else that's coming into this room. Don't forget, we've got an hour break for the game design track, but we'll be back at 1 p.m. back in Sahara B for their Kickstarter. So, or I should say,
Thank you everybody for
discussion
coming.
about
I
it.
hope that
Thank
you
you
got
so
something out
much.
of this.